He had no name, no number, but he had my face tucked into his pocket, and I never took that picture with him. There are things that can't be put into words, and yet they live within us as if they were spoken every day. There are memories we don't know if we invented, dreamed, or if someone planted them in the silence of our heads, just so we'd never sleep peacefully again. When I think of that man, in that moment, when the blood still dripped from his ribs and the lamplight flickered on the canvas floor, I remember the photograph. I remember the crease in the left corner, the fine dust in his eyes, and me, there, on the paper, smiling beside him. It wasn't a montage, it wasn't a joke. It was a real old image, with colors washed out by time and the rough feel of worn paper. But I never took that photo. I don't remember meeting that man. And yet, his face, he looked at me as if he'd finally found his way back, as if he knew I was the only one who could hear what he didn't dare say. For many years I kept this story in the same place I kept the photo, among books no one reads anymore, in boxes with faded labels, among smells only my memory recognizes. And sometimes I think that if I had delivered it as instructed, I would have lost myself too, because some presences don't ask permission to return. They just return. My name is Nellie Jo Raymond. I'm 86 years old, and for over 4 decades I've lived alone in a low, colorful, and stubborn house here in Austin, Texas. My hair turned gray early, short and unruly, just like I was when I was young. My living room walls are covered in psychedelic designs that no one quite understands, but which remind me of the days when the world seemed to fit into a protest and a cup of tea. The fan spins slowly on the ceiling, and sometimes I think it's imitating me, spinning around and around without moving. I volunteered in a refugee camp in Bangladesh in 1971. I saw children dying without names, women giving birth alone in the mud, men without eyes, without legs, without a map. I thought I'd seen enough to not be shocked by anything anymore. But what haunts me most wasn't the horror. It was the question I still can't answer. Sit here with me. Because this story doesn't appear in any medical records, but it's sewn into me like a scar that time couldn't erase. And if you feel like some memories only live on when they're told, then subscribe to the channel. This is a safe place. It was late afternoon when he arrived, or rather when they left him on the grimy canvas floor, along with the other makeshift stretchers. I was helping change the bandages of an 11-year-old boy, his ribs protruding from his chest, when I heard the sound of hurried footsteps, the urgent murmur of Bengali, and then silence. One of those thick silences that precede death, or something very much like it. I approached slowly, having learned that running doesn't always help. The man lay on his side, his shirt soaked with dried blood, his eyes half closed. He didn't respond to touch. He had no identification bracelet, no paper pinned to his clothes, no name whispered by his keeper. It was just him, and the harsh sound of his breathing fighting against his body. I looked around, hoping for an explanation, but the 2 men who had carried him had already disappeared into the dust of the field. He was different. I can't explain it. His beard was sparse. His dark, tangled hair was paler than usual. His feet were bare. And he smelled strange. Of time, perhaps. Of absence. "We don't have a file for him," the other nurse said, looking at my clipboard. I just nodded. Not every life passes through a piece of paper, I thought. I grabbed a gauze pad with warm water and began cleaning his face. It was an automatic gesture, but at that moment I had the impression his lips moved. Just a little. Almost a whisper. I pointed the lamp to the side, and that's when I saw it. The inside pocket of his shirt was folded over, as if he were hiding something. I carefully inserted my fingers. I pulled. It was a piece of paper, thick, with yellow edges. I unfolded it slowly. First I saw a faded sky, then 2 silhouettes. My fingers trembled before the thought could form. It was a photograph, and in it, me, holding hands with that very man. But that couldn't be true. I've never been there. I never took that picture. And yet, I recognized the blouse he was wearing, the large hoop earrings, the crooked smile I only show when I'm nervous. The nurse beside me asked if everything was okay. I tucked the photo into my apron pocket and lied with my eyes. Yes, I said. But inside me, something was already beginning to unravel. I should have moved on, treated the wounded man like so many others, marked his body as anonymous, registered him as another nameless survivor in that long line of forgotten souls. But I couldn't. That photograph tucked into his pocket was an invisible thorn that stuck in my side and wouldn't go away. No matter how much I tried to think about protocol, cleanliness, survival, it was as if something on that paper was pulling me out of time. I ran my fingers over the image silently, at the edge of my hammock, away from other eyes and ears. It was the kind of photo you only take on calm days, when you believe there will be a later. A river backdrop, a clear sky, 2 faces side by side. And among those faces, mine. Without a doubt, mine. There was no mistaking the way I lick my lips before smiling, or that large blue ceramic earring, which I swore I'd lost years later. But I didn't remember that place, or the man beside me. The robe I was wearing in the photo was identical to the one I bought in the Dhaka market. Only that purchase had happened 2 years after the date someone scrawled on the back. And yet, there it was, worn by me, before it existed in my memory. The image bore no studio branding or stamp. It was a cheap, almost homemade print, the kind of thing someone folds carefully and holds close to their chest like a prayer. I tried to rationalize, but all I found was noise. No explanation fit within it. I hid the photograph between the pages of a notebook, the one where I wrote names that perhaps no one else would remember. Even there it seemed to radiate something. Not light, not sound, but a quiet restlessness, as if its presence within the paper challenged what I knew about myself. I returned to the tent later. The man's fever had risen. He remained motionless, but there was a persistent tremor in his hands, as if he carried something more than pain. I tended to him with automatic gestures, as I had done hundreds of times with others. But there was a subtle, impossible-to-ignore difference, the way his body reacted to touch, not as a stranger, but as something that had been recognized before. In the wee hours of the morning, I sat on the edge of my bed in silence. I looked at him, then at the folded photo in my lap, then at the canvas wall. The world seemed suspended out of sync, and inside me, something wavered between disbelief and a deep form of fear, the fear that my own memory was deceiving me, or worse, that it was protecting me from something I had once erased. The days that followed were filled with a thick silence, the kind born not from the absence of sound, but from the uneasy presence of something unnamed. The man remained there, lying on the last stretcher in the row, his eyes half closed, his lips dry, his body floating between fever and numbness. But it was as if his presence grew within the space, a body so still, and yet it seemed to fill the entire tent. I watched him from afar, feigning routine. I checked his blood pressure, changed his bandages, recorded his temperature. On the outside, everything was the same. On the inside, everything was in suspense. Every time I got closer to him, an uneasy feeling flared within me, as if he recognized me, as if he were waiting for me to remember something that hadn't yet surfaced. There was something disturbing about the way he looked calm. It wasn't serenity. It was resignation, like someone who's seen too much, like someone who's lived enough to know that what's coming next isn't exactly life, but it's not death either. There was a ghostly sweetness in that bruised face, as if behind the ruin there was memory, as if he wasn't just there, but returning. There were more than a few times when I found myself standing in front of the stretcher, my eyes fixed on its features, trying to pull from my mind some forgotten memory, some intersection of paths, some fragment that would explain that strange feeling of reunion. But nothing came, no clear recollection, only blurred impressions. A smell that reminded me of mornings at the station. A hunch in the shoulders that evoked someone waiting for me, in a life that perhaps never existed. I knew how to recognize feverish delirium. I had seen soldiers call out to their dead mothers, grown men weep for brothers they never had. I knew how to differentiate hallucination from longing. But what touched me there was deeper. It was a recognition without a point of origin, something that came not from the mind, but from the body. A strange kind of echo, as if my heart and his had preserved some ancient rhythm, shared before reason could remember. Some nights I'd return to my hammock and spend hours in silence, with the photo hidden under my pillow. I didn't need to look at it. It was enough to feel its weight. And that weight didn't come from the paper, but from what it implied. The possibility that this man wasn't just a forgotten survivor, but a witness to something that belonged to me. Something that had been lived, or dreamed, or invented so carefully that it ended up becoming real. It was on a muggy morning with pale light and slow flies that doubt began to take shape within me. Not as a clear thought, but as a seep. A discreet humidity that seeps through the cracks of certainty until it soaks everything that once seemed firm. I was organizing the boxes of compresses at the back of the tent when I found myself standing there, staring into space, my mind stitching together scenes I couldn't quite place. Scenes with him, with me, as if there were a hidden story behind the curtain of consciousness. A story someone erased, but left a trace. It wasn't the first time I'd felt this kind of crack. Over the years of volunteering, I'd grown accustomed to seeing people's faces repeat themselves in others. Children who resembled dead siblings, gestures that seemed to be from long-ago lovers. The human mind, I learned early on, is a place full of traps and mirrors. But this was different. This was intimate. It was as if my memory wasn't failing. It was protecting itself. I began revisiting my own journals, old drafts, lists of names, notes from voices that once called out to me for help. And suddenly, I realized there were gaps, torn pages, entire months that held no image for me. I knew where I'd been, who I'd worked with, what I'd done, but I no longer felt the emotional weight of these records. As if someone had wiped away the most human part of my memory and left only the bare bones of fact. No one around me commented on him. None of the doctors seemed to care about the lack of documents. No one else mentioned the blank file, as if it were natural for a bleeding man to appear in the middle of the field with no origin, no destination, no name. Only I felt that discomfort. Only I seemed trapped by an invisible bond that connected me to him and that inexplicable portrait. It was then that doubt took hold. What if he hadn't appeared by chance? What if his presence in that place was more than a coincidence? What if what he carried was more than visible wounds? I began to see him as an enigma, not a patient, a mirror that forced me to face a version of myself I might have forgotten. There was something in his silences that reminded me of my own, as if we were trapped in the same story but in different chapters, and I no longer knew which page my life had turned to. The photograph's paper began to change, not visually. There were no new tears, no additional stains, but there was something there that transformed into silence, that called to me in the moments when I tried to forget it. I began to notice a smell. At first, I thought it was in my head. Then I was sure. An old, almost faded perfume, sweet and uncomfortable, like a childhood memory buried in a wooden box. It wasn't sweat, nor mold. It was some subtle essence, something between dry jasmine and damp earth, a fragrance I hadn't worn in decades. And yet I recognized it. It was the same scent of the handkerchief I kept after my mother's death, the same perfume I smelled on the collar of a man I danced with one night in a rented room in New Orleans, and whom I never saw again. The scent of something that never ended, but that time had pushed to the back of the drawers. And there it was, imbued with that image that silently watched me, as if it knew that smell is the last thing memory abandons. I began to dream of that smell, not of faces, not of facts, just of sensations. The weight of the portrait in my hands, the fabric of the tunic touching my skin, the muffled sound of leaves falling on zinc roof tiles, and the smell, constant, as if my mind were trying to stitch together my senses to remember something my eyes didn't want to see. In one of these dreams, I saw the man, not wounded, but standing before me, in another time, in a city with signs I couldn't read. He smiled but didn't speak. He handed me something, then walked away. I woke with my heart racing, my hands sweaty. I ran to the notebook where I kept the photo. I don't know what I expected to find. A change, a sign, a name hidden in the margins. But everything was the same. Everything. Except one thing. The smell had changed. Now it was stronger. As if the photograph were being inhabited again. I sat for hours, the paper between my fingers, my nose pressed against the fold. And there, for the first time, I felt something I couldn't name. An absence too intimate to be alien. As if within that portrait was contained a part of me that time had separated, but not taken. That was the day I realized. He didn't want to be saved. At least, not in the way I imagined. That night, the camp was plunged into a darkness, not only due to the lack of electricity. The storm had begun at dusk, with dry thunder and gusts of wind that lifted the tent canvas and made the dogs howl in unison. The generators failed shortly after, leaving only the faint glow of kerosene lamps and the muffled creak of makeshift structures struggling to withstand the gale. All ordinary sounds disappeared. No voices, no laughter, no hurried footsteps, only the sound of the wind. A sound that seemed to penetrate everything, even the skin. In the dim light of the ward, shapes blurred together. The thick curtains swayed like silent ghosts. And there, at the end of the row, he still stood, still, but present. His body remained beneath the stained sheet, but something was different. Even from a distance, even in the darkness, a strange vibration could be felt in the space, as if time were trapped inside, folded like the portrait I still held close to my chest. I went to check on the patients, one by one, counting steps silently, without writing anything down. When I reached his stretcher, I stopped. He wasn't asleep. His eyes were open, fixed on some point on the ceiling I couldn't reach. His skin glistened with feverish sweat, but his gaze was clear. There was no delirium there. There was wakefulness. I felt a shiver run down my spine, as if a name belonging to me was being spoken, but without sound. And even without looking directly at me, he seemed to know I was there, as if he had always known, as if he had been waiting for this specific moment. My feet stuck to the clay floor, my breath shallow. And then, he moved his head slightly, as if listening to something that only exists within the mind. At the same moment, the lamp beside me went out. No breath, no wind, just silence. A silence that weighed more heavily than any sound I'd ever heard. Everything in me wanted to flee. Instinct, reason, even faith. But I didn't move. I stood there, frozen, as if time itself had decided to trap the air between us. Minutes later, I don't know how many, the light returned, dim, timid, and when his features were revealed again in the shadows, I realized something. His right hand was closed, clutching something tightly. It wasn't pain. It was attachment. And it struck me with a terrible clarity. There was something in that man that knew me. Not like a patient knows a nurse, but like a mirror knows its reflection. I returned to my tent before dawn, without saying a word to anyone. I sat in the hammock, pulled the notebook from its hiding place, and opened it to the page with the photo. And for a second, I swear I felt her eyes, my eyes, looking back at me with a different expression, as if she now knew something I didn't yet. The morning after the blackout, I went to the table of forgotten belongings. It was a makeshift corner between two cracked wooden shelves, where we left the objects taken from the pockets of the injured. Empty wallets, crooked rings, loose buttons, sodden photographs. The tag from his bag was still there, held together by a grimy string. I picked it up carefully. I needed to see it again. I needed to confirm that there was nothing there but the photo. That what I felt was just a stumble of a tired mind, not a buried truth trying to emerge. I opened the bag slowly, as if I were stirring ancient bones. The portrait was gone. I had hidden it among my own papers. But inside, folded with meticulous precision, were 3 sheets of yellowed paper. Letters, handwritten, with blue ink darkened by age and carefully aligned edges. The handwriting was neat, rounded with small gaps in the consonant strokes. Too familiar. I read the first paragraph breathlessly, then the second, and the third. Every line was a reflection. The way he said goodbye, the way the words flowed with restrained emotion, even the spelling mistakes. All mine. But I didn't remember writing any of those words. The letters were addressed to Joe. The signature at the bottom was illegible, a smear of ink that looked like it had been wetted by tears or rain. But the content was clear. They spoke of hidden encounters, of promises exchanged beneath palm trees, of a crossing that never happened. Whole sentences sounded like excerpts from pages of my diary, but they weren't in any of the copies I kept. It was as if someone had read me from within and transcribed it for another time, or as if I had written it myself. In a moment, my memory refused to retain. I held the pages for long minutes, feeling the weight of the paper and the even heavier weight of doubt. Would I have written? Would I have loved this man? Would I have promised him what was now forgotten? Or was it all part of a shared delirium between a feverish body and an exhausted mind? There was no rational explanation, only a growing certainty. There was something between us that escaped logic, something that matter couldn't contain. Maybe time, maybe loss, maybe unlived love. But the most disturbing thing was this. The letters weren't dirty, nor wrinkled. They seemed to have been recently folded, as if they'd just been written, as if they'd been waiting for me. That night I didn't sleep. I left the letters open on the table next to the portrait, and I stared at the paper for hours, as if at some point the words would move, or as if someone, from some other point in time, would appear to retrieve them. The camp had a small metal container converted into a bathroom, with a stained mirror hanging crookedly on the back wall. It was where I washed my face every morning between shifts. A simple mirror, scratched by steam and age, the kind that barely reflects the image in its entirety. But that day, it gave me something else. I rested my hands on the stone sink and stared. The face was mine, of course. The freckles, the short white strands, sticking out to the sides, the tunic wrinkled on my narrow shoulders. But there was a strangeness there. The reflection looked more tired than I felt, older, as if it had aged at a different rate than I had. There was something in the eyes, a kind of weariness that didn't come from sleepless nights, but from living with the unreal. I leaned closer. I stretched the corners of my eyes, pulled at the skin on my chin. I tried to rediscover features I recognized from my youth, but every line of my face seemed to tell a story I didn't remember living. It was as if the mirror reflected not just the present, but overlapping layers of all the women I've been, including those who left me no memories. Behind me, through the crack in the door, I saw the reflection of the empty hallway. But for a brief moment, I swear I saw a shadow pass, as if someone had silently crossed my path. I turned immediately, but there was no one. I returned to the mirror, and what I saw made me recoil. The image of the photo, for a second, overlapped my reflection. That version of me, smiling beside the man, in that place of river and low sun, appeared for a split second, as if the glass had become a membrane between distinct times. I blinked, and it was just me again. I touched the mirror with my fingertips. It was as cold as ever, and yet something felt broken, not in the glass, but in me, as if that morning had split my image in half, the woman I was, and the one I might have been in another reality, with another name, another time, another love. I left the container without drying myself properly. The air outside seemed thicker, as if carrying particles of unspoken memories. I returned to the infirmary, but the entire way there I stared at my feet. I avoided the eyes of others. I avoided the sky. I avoided anything that might remind me that there was a part of me that perhaps had been purposefully forgotten. On the third day without answers, I began to notice eyes. Not the open, inquisitive ones that directly accuse, but the slanted, cornered ones that cut the air like a cold blade. The camp, chaotic as it was, possessed its own order, and within that order there were eyes that saw more than they said. One of them belonged to the sergeant in charge of night patrols, a rigid man with firm steps and restrained gestures. He never said much, and it was precisely this silence that bothered me. I began to notice his movements. He walked around the ward more often than necessary. He didn't approach the other wounded, but he walked slowly past the stretcher of the man without a file. He paused for seconds too long. He observed. He didn't ask anything, but his eyes had the kind of attention that seeks inconsistency. He pretended to look for something in the records, but he never touched the clipboards. He stayed there as if waiting for time to reveal what the paper hides. That afternoon, I left the cafeteria early. I sensed something was off. When I arrived at the infirmary, I found his bag of belongings rummaged through, thrown on the back table. The letters were no longer organized. The fold of the photograph, which I had carefully tucked between the pages of my notebook, was creased differently, as if strange hands had touched something that didn't belong to them. Nothing was taken, but everything had been violated. That night I kept my mouth shut. I didn't tell anyone. I simply removed the photo from its hiding place and hid it close to my body, tucked between my tunic and my skin. Not for fear of losing it, but because I understood, instinctively, that there was something in that paper that could no longer be exposed. From the corner of the tent, I noticed the sergeant watching me again. His arms crossed, his brow furrowed. There was no threat in his face, but there was an unspoken judgment, an unease. Something like, why is she still standing beside him? And that's when I understood. It wasn't just the injured who were off the list. It was me too. It was during a routine dressing. The wound on the side of his abdomen had become infected, and the doctor had ordered a deeper cleaning before changing the antibiotics. I waited for everyone to leave the tent before performing the procedure. I had learned over the years that there are silences only the suffering body knows, and it was in these moments of contained pain that some truths revealed themselves without the need for words. I calmly prepared my supplies: gloves, tweezers, compresses soaked in solution, adhesive tape. I slowly lifted his dirty tunic, revealing the stitches and bruised skin. But something made me stop. Above the fresh wound, slightly to the right, was an old scar. Thin, well-healed, like a poorly cared-for childhood cut. A familiar mark, so familiar that my own body reacted before my mind. Instinctively, I pulled up the sleeve of my tunic and ran my fingers along the side of my stomach. It was there, exactly there, on the same side, the same crooked line, the same texture of skin that never returned to its smoothness. A scar I'd carried since I was 11, when I fell on broken glass, while running away from home after a fight with my sister. A story no one else knew. A pain I'd never shared, not even in my diaries. I froze. The tweezers had fallen from my hand without me noticing. My breath caught in my chest. It couldn't be a coincidence. It couldn't just be an anatomical similarity. The mark wasn't just similar. It was identical. And it was in the same place, the same shape, as if it had been made on the same day. As if, by some logic my mind couldn't grasp, or he had experienced what I had, or been part of it. Reason tried to scream inside me. It searched for explanations. Genetics, delirium, emotional transference, misperception. But no theory could account for the power of that image. Two strange, distant bodies, connected by a scar that time had tried to hide. It wasn't just a wound. It was a signature. I finished the dressing with trembling hands. I covered the skin more carefully than usual, as if covering something sacred, a secret the body itself had decided to reveal. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't write it down. I didn't bring it up. But from that moment on, I began to see it differently. No longer as a man off the list, but like something, or someone, that knew me inside and out. Dawn arrived heavy, damp, like a sodden cotton cloth covering one's face without warning. The heat had disappeared, and the warm wind carried the bittersweet scent of burning garbage mixed with night-blooming jasmine. It was my shift, but I couldn't close my eyes. Ever since I saw the scar on his body, my sleep had become a restless wait, a vigil for something I couldn't name, but I sensed was about to happen. I got up before the first rooster and walked to the infirmary. The dirt floor crunched under my footsteps, and the sky was still gray, undecided whether it would turn into day or remain shadowy. As I opened the tent canvas, I first felt the emptiness. Not just any emptiness, but the kind that sudden absence leaves behind, like losing something that had been there for years and is suddenly gone. His stretcher was empty. There were no rumpled sheets, no bandages out of place. Everything seemed too tidy, and this artificial order filled me with dread. I looked around. The other patients were asleep. The supplies were intact. No noise, no sign of struggle, flight, or urgency. Just absence. Dense, inexplicable. I searched the restrooms. I went to the registration desk. I walked around the camp. No movement, no warning. No one had seen him leave. The sergeant pretended not to know anything. The doctors didn't even seem to notice his absence. And the more I asked, the more I felt alone in that moment, as if the man had never existed outside of my memory. I returned to my tent and rummaged through everything. The photo was still there. The letters, too. But something felt different about them, as if they'd lost their warmth, as if his presence somehow kept those objects alive. Without him, the paper was just paper. For 12 hours I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I didn't breathe properly. Every sound from the camp made me look toward the entrance, hoping to see him return. But there were no tracks, no sign of an exit, no footsteps imprinted in the mud newly formed by the light rain. It was as if he had evaporated. And then, at dusk, when the sky was beginning to take on a lilac-gray hue, he reappeared. It was a nurse who spotted him first. He was unconscious near the north fence, where the weeds grew tall and where no one usually passed. He was lying on his side, ankle-deep in mud and with dried blood under his fingernails, as if he'd been digging, or scratching, or struggling against something that was pulling him elsewhere. They brought him back to the tent. He was still breathing, but his signals were faint. His body was cold, as if he'd spent an entire night in another world. He didn't say anything, not even when he woke up. But when I pulled back the sheet to reassess his wounds, I saw that the side bandage had been removed, and in place of the scar that mirrored mine, there was only smooth skin, as if it had never been there. The next day dawned with a strange silence, as if the entire camp had lost its voice. Not even the radios crackled. The wind passed between the tarps more timidly, and the birds, always so impatient in the mornings, seemed to have forgotten to sing. The infirmary tent was colder than usual, and the man remained unconscious, his eyes closed as if he were asleep inside, in a time that was no longer this. I tended the wounds with slow movements, trying to understand why the scar had disappeared. My memory couldn't possibly have made it up. I knew that mark like I know my own hands. But now, before me, it had vanished like a shadow erased by the first light of day. It was then that I heard a strange sound. Tiny, uneven footsteps approaching from the side of the ward. I instinctively turned toward the entrance and saw, standing right at the edge of the canvas, a child. She was no more than 7 years old. Her hair was tied in 2 long braids, her feet bare, and her dress was a worn blue, stained with dust and time. She looked at me with the firmness only some children possess. That firmness that comes not from courage but from knowledge adults have forgotten. She didn't seem lost or scared. She was present, completely present, as if she'd come with a purpose, as if she knew exactly where she was and why. She stood there motionless, her eyes fixed on me. I waited for her to say something, but she merely raised a hand and pointed toward the stretcher where he slept. The gesture was calm, precise. Then her lips moved. No sound. But I understood. Not by hearing, but by feeling. She had said my name. Because. The same name written in the letters. The same name whispered in the midst of the fever. The name he carried without ever having heard from my lips. A chill ran through me. I took a step forward, but the next moment she was gone. As if she'd never been there. As if the ground had swallowed her presence, or the wind had carried her to another corner of time. I ran out of the tent. I looked around. Nothing. No footprints, no movement, no trail. Just the silent field, the dull sky, and the distant sound of a rusty engine. I went back inside, still trembling. The man remained motionless, but now his face had a new look, a lightness at the corners of his lips, as if he'd heard something that had soothed him, a whisper coming from a place only he and that girl could inhabit. I stood there for minutes that felt like an eternity. And in that instant, I understood that logic had completely gone, that this story wasn't meant to be understood. It was meant to be felt, because sometimes when we don't know who we are, time sends a child to remind us. There was a notebook I carried in my early years in the field, before we even had official records or printed forms. It was a soft-cover diary, faded beige, with thin pages, and a flower pressed between the last pages. In it, I didn't record clinical data. It was more intimate than that. There. I wrote down fragments of what remained to me at the end of my shifts. Loose sentences, sensations, fears that couldn't be spoken aloud. It was with it that I learned to organize pain in silence. And it was also the one that disappeared, mysteriously, in 1968. I searched for weeks at the time. I rummaged through suitcases and boxes, asked colleagues. No one knew. It was as if it had dissolved into thin air. I wept for it as if I had lost a part of myself. And perhaps I had. Over time, I resigned myself to it. I thought it had been blown away or forgotten in some move. But I could never erase the memory of that object. I knew, word for word, what had been written there. It was my way of not falling apart, my way of existing where no one truly knew me. That's why my body froze when, while changing the unconscious wounded man's shirt, I noticed something crumpled, stuck between the lining seams. A piece of paper folded many times, frayed at the edges, smelling of old storage. I pulled it gently. My hands were shaking even before I saw the contents. As soon as I opened the first fold, the memory shot through me like a lightning bolt. It was a page from my diary. The handwriting was mine. The ink was familiar. Even the little coffee smudge I'd made that early morning when I wrote in bed, holding the mug in my left hand. That wasn't a copy. It was the original. And not just any page. It was the very one I remembered ripping out and burning. A short, feverish text, written on a night when I considered fleeing the camp. It spoke of identity, of being in a place where no one called me by my full name, where I could just be Joe. And that was enough. At the bottom of that page, with my own handwriting on top of it, someone had underlined a sentence. Just one. What if time is not a line, but a knot? I closed my eyes, clutching the paper to my chest. It was like holding proof of something that shouldn't exist. The page I burned was there, stained with dried blood, with my words, with a sentence marked by someone who couldn't have read it. And yet, you read it. I looked at him. He remained motionless, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm too calm, almost out of time. And then I understood. He didn't come for help. He came to give me back what I lost. The morning after discovering the page, I was summoned to the administrative tent. The orders came bluntly. The man was to be transferred. A detachment was coming from outside, and they would take all undocumented wounded for triage in another area. More control, they said. More security. No arguments were necessary. He wasn't on the list, and that was precisely what made him dangerous. I nodded, but something inside broke. It wasn't fear of what they would do to him. It was fear that they would erase what was between us, that they would seal once and for all this bond that time somehow still insisted on keeping alive. I spent the day watching him from afar. He was sleeping soundly, but his face seemed less tense, as if he knew, as if he'd expected this outcome. Each nurse who approached his stretcher was like a subtle threat. They didn't touch him aggressively, but there was a strangeness, a distance, as if he were emitting a kind of noise that only instincts could detect. A sign that there was something about him that didn't fit on paper. That night, with everyone tucked in, I entered the ward through the side. I carried a blanket, a water bottle, and a small vial of antibiotics. Enough for a few days. I lightly touched his shoulder. His eyes opened slowly. I said nothing. Neither did he. And in that silence, we made the decision together. Behind the tent, where old supplies were stacked, there was a gap between two abandoned structures. A makeshift hiding place used years ago to protect children during an evacuation. No one remembered it anymore. I covered the entrance with cloths and boxes, leaving only a crack of air. There I arranged his body, not as someone abandoning someone, but as someone returning someone. I didn't cry. I just trembled. My body knew what my heart was still reluctant to accept, that hiding someone is sometimes the only way to protect them from oblivion. I spent the next 2 days as a shadow. I responded with gestures, smiled with my lips, but inside I was just listening. Until the convoy arrived. They took the missing names. They searched for him, of course. They searched tents, read records, questioned absences. But the list didn't say where he was, and no one suspected me, because I was just Joe, one nurse among many, and he was just one more missing person. After that, the days went on, as they always do, but nothing went back to normal, because in that moment, in that makeshift hiding place among old tarps and empty boxes, I left a part of myself behind, a part that never left. The last time I saw him was without seeing him. There was no goodbye, no words, no gestures, just the realization that he was no longer in hiding. The folded blanket, the empty antibiotic bottle, and a dense feeling of absence filled the space between the boxes. For a moment I thought he had left during the night, alone, with what little he had. But there was something there that didn't quite match abandonment. It was as if he had been removed from there by time itself, as if that hiding place were merely a temporary station between what was and what could never be. I took a deep breath. I closed the gap with the same hands that had opened it, and I returned to my tent with a new kind of silence within me. It wasn't relief, nor sadness. It was a bitter acceptance that some presences aren't meant to last, only to make a mark. It took weeks for me to find what he left. It was inside my notebook, between 2 pages I would never have revisited by chance. The texture of the paper was different, newer, more vibrant. When I opened it, I smelled the same scent I'd recognized in the first photograph, a subtle blend of jasmine, earth, and frozen time. And then I saw it. It was another photo, but not that old, faded one, in which I appeared next to him in a landscape that didn't belong to me. This was new. In it, I was older, with the same short white hair I have now, the same hoop earring, the same tired look, and beside me, he, also aged, his features softer, his beard stubbled with grey, and behind us, the facade of my current home in Austin, the house I only bought years after leaving the countryside, the house where I'm sitting now. There was no development mark, no date, no stamp, just the image, clear, sharp, impossible. I stood there for countless minutes, the photo clutched between my fingers, my chest tight, the world slipping between reality and symbolism. And for the first time, I didn't try to understand. I didn't search for logic. I didn't review memories. I didn't run to my notebooks. I simply let that absurd proof exist. And perhaps that's what he wanted to leave. Not answers, but a concrete reminder that something was experienced, even if it was outside of time. Even if it was outside of my understanding. Since then, I've kept it inside a book that no one ever picks up. And sometimes, when the wind blows lower and the fan spins slower, I look at it again, and I wonder, what if time, in fact, isn't a line, but a knot? Some people believe that time moves forward, like a road that never returns, that takes everything with it and leaves only the dust of memories behind. But I don't know if I believe that anymore. After what I've experienced, or what I've perhaps only touched with the fingers of my soul, I've begun to think that time is made of small turns, of bonds that tighten when we least expect it. That time, sometimes, doesn't pass. It rests and waits, The man who wasn't on the list never had a name. He never had a medical record. He never had a certificate of arrival, nor a departure authorization. But he had my face in his pocket. He held my story in his hands. And he left a space in me that no logic could fill. For a long time I tried to silence it. I pretended it was just a delirium of exhaustion, a noise somewhere between sleep and fever. But the portrait remains. The letters are still here. The diary page, too. And deep down, my intuition always knew. Not everything that's real needs to make sense. When I think of him now, I don't see him as someone I rescued, nor as a man who passed through the field like so many others. I see an old stained mirror where forgotten parts of myself have resurfaced. A reflection that only appeared when I let my guard down, when I allowed something inexplicable to touch me without resistance. There were days I tried to forget, days I hid the photo deeper in my bookshelves, days I slammed my notebook shut. But he always came back, sometimes in the sound of the fan spinning in the wee hours, sometimes in a childhood dream I never had, sometimes in a reflection that, for an instant, seemed to smile at me with his eyes. I don't know that man's name. I don't know where he came from, or where he went. I only know he carried a piece of me with him, and when he disappeared, he took part of who I was. But he left something behind, too. He left an echo that lives deep in my silences, a reminder that, even off the list, there are lives that belong to us more than the ones we try to remember. Today, when I walk around the house, I sometimes stop before the framed portrait on the shelf, the second photo, the one that shouldn't exist, and I look at the two of us, older, more real than any memory I have. I don't seek explanations. I just let the knot of time embrace me. I let doubt be my companion, because there are memories that don't need to be understood, only felt. If you've listened this far, perhaps you carry something like this too, a name that wasn't spoken, a love that wasn't lived, a photograph that was never taken, but that still lives inside you. And if that's the case, then perhaps we're healing together, even without knowing it. Comment below, or just listen. That's enough.